Oh God, as we now direct our attention to this book of Acts, where we see the beginnings of the church and people who are followers of Christ and how they live their faith out in a world that sometimes is receptive and sometimes is not. And as even though it's a different place and a different time, part of what we study in the book of Acts is consistent with who we are and what our task is and what sits before us. So what we pray, Lord, is that in our reflections around the text, our conversations around the text, our time here together in fellowship, we invite you to use this in a way that it's leveraged so that what's created inside of us is something, well, the same thing that's created inside of the apostles and the first followers of Jesus. And that is that the nature of Christ lives and breathes and becomes a witness and a something that is a testimony to your kingdom that is ushered in Jesus Christ. And all this, oh God, we give thanks and we pray this in your name. Amen. There should be the prayer pad going around as well. And then there should be one handout. I'm going to go ahead and shut this. And the handout is a quote by N.T. Wright. It's a New Testament scholar. And it has to do, if we get to the end of the chapter, that would be fantastic. And I'm not going to call it a miracle, but it would be pretty close to it. And but it's a quote at the end, particularly when Stephen is stoned. All right, so we're Acts chapter 7. Before we look in 7, is there anything that we need to kind of recap or touch again that has to deal with chapter 6 or 5 or anything leading up to this point? Anything unclear or, in your own thoughts about this, you walk away a little fuzzy? So, all right, so Acts chapter 7, all right, to kind of catch us back up to speed, you have these... You have this problem that exists inside the church. It has to deal, or it deals with the Hellenist Christians, and then it deals with the Jerusalem Christians or the Jewish Christians, and mainly around what happens in a church or in a group whenever there's a lot of growth, a fair amount of activity, and around pastoral care. And in this case, you had one portion of the church that was being cared for compared to another side of the church that it wasn't. So they present the problem to the apostles. The apostles tell them to elect or choose 7 people. Stephen's one of them. The apostles pray for the 7, lay hands on the 7, and it's their job then to take care of the daily distribution. Up until chapter 6, there are 3 times in Acts already where it talks about how in the early church, people gave to care for the community. And so some of that had to do with how do you distribute the funds for that, how do you distribute the food and the care for those where it's a struggle. These 7, that's their task. And so in chapter 6, we get insight into that, and then right at about midway through chapter 6, you see where at least one of the 7, in this case Stephen, branches out even more than just the daily distribution. That in some form or fashion he is moving into the area of evangelism, and he is pretty much arrested and is tried before the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is the Supreme Court for this time. And in this area, Jerusalem was divided into different counties or districts, and each one had a representative, like a judge, and then together they made up the Sanhedrin. The majority of the Sanhedrin is made up of what we call Sadducees, which are the priestly class and order, and a number of those of their descendants, many landowners, and then the minority group in the Sanhedrin are the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are not clergy or priests. They're lay people whose job is to reform Judaism back to something that is basically they want to legislate life so that people don't sin. And so that they make up Sanhedrin. Stephen is brought before the Sanhedrin, and he is the charge or the charges have to do with blasphemy around the four major centers or central part of Israel, and that is the name of God. Incidentally, he doesn't blaspheme the name of God, but also the idea of the Old Testament tied around Moses, the temple, and then ultimately the law. In that case would be the worship or the sacrificial system. And when so that's chapter 6. We in chapter 6. This is where he's at. He's in front of the Sanhedrin. And chapter 7 is his defense in the form of a sermon or a talk, or I don't know if it's a sermon per se, but he is giving his defense to the Sanhedrin, and it pretty much follows this pattern and we're going to look at it all hopefully today. The beginning of it has to do with the patriarchs, and so he's going to go back to Abraham. Whenever people talk about the patriarchs in the Old Testament, New Testament, primarily what they mean first is Abraham, and they might get to Joseph, but most time it's Abraham, or Abraham and Isaac, Jacob. But when you study Old Testament, New Testament, whenever somebody mentions the patriarchs, often they just identify Abraham. And then we move into under Joseph, Israel's in Egypt, and then there's a couple of parts that have to do with Moses. One, the call of Moses, who he is, what's his purpose, and then under his leadership when the children of Israel are out in the wilderness. And then the last part has to do with the temple, and what we mean by that is the actual temple itself, the physical temple. And then, of course, the very end of chapter 7 is the Sanhedrin basically doesn't buy his defense, and there's a portion of those, some of the zealots of the Sanhedrin pretty much take Stephen out back, and they stone him to death. And that's the end of chapter 7. And or maybe we get into chapter 8 when that happens. Yep, at the very beginning of chapter 8. And then in chapter 8, which I know we will not get to today, just so you can whet your appetite for 2020, wow, for next year, is we move on to a different person of the 7, Philip. And Philip is doing the same thing as Stephen. He's branching out after or away from the daily distribution now into some form of an evangelist. So, lot to do. Any questions before we jump into the actual defense or sermon? We all good? All right. If someone would read for us Acts chapter 7, let's go with verses 1 through 8. Not all together. All right, thank you. All right, so we get the beginning of his defense. Now, one of the things that are hopefully you'll see in the defense is regardless if we're talking about the patriarchs or Israel or the temple or what have you, what Stephen is going to constantly bring before the Sanhedrin is this idea that the presence of God is not restricted to one single material place. And so just think about that for a minute. I mean, because what is developed is that the temple is the place for the house of God, is the presence of God. This is where God dwells. Some of you that visited Israel earlier this year, part of what we did is we saw the foundations of the temple, and you saw people, the Wailing Wall. The reason why people go and pray in front of the Wailing Wall is because this is part of the remnant of the temple, and by touching the wall, they're touching where God lives. It's like touching God's house. So that's been around for a while, all right? So when Solomon consecrated the temple back in the Old Testament, what you have then is that we want you to dwell in this place. This is your place. And when the temple veil is torn in two, the symbolism of that in the Gospels is that now there's, God is not confined to an area. There's access to God, God to the people to God. And so Stephen is going to critique at least this thought in the first century that the presence of God is not defined by a physical place, a building, a locality, a geography. And if that is the case, then the people of God should not be. Now, that on one level, we say, do we have a problem with that? Anybody? You okay with that? All right, it's all good. So, or are we? All right, so but now think about what we do when it comes to how we see the sanctuary or the CWC or the chapel and things like that. Now we consecrate that place, we say it's a place of worship, things like that, but we sort of hold both sides, together where, yes, the physical place is important, but at the same time, it is not important. So what we don't want to do is draw a conclusion that says no physical place is important. But we don't want to be in the camp that says, well, it's got to be in this area or this box. Now I'm not up to date. So those that are in the Altar Guild, you feel free to tell me I'm wrong, which is okay. The great thing about St. Paul, there's so many people do so many things. You don't have to worry about it. It's like awesome. And but in other churches that I served, smaller churches, you're kind of over everything. And I remember in one appointment where the altar wasn't set up correctly. And so just before no one was in the church, the sanctuary, but just a few folks. This was maybe 30 minutes before the service. And I ran in, I was grabbing the stuff off the altar, and I'm not going to mention her name, but one of the matriarchs was like, whoa! And I was like, what do you mean? She goes, you're not wearing gloves. And I was like, gloves? I was touching, parts of the altar without my gloves on. And because those are the physical things that represent to some degree the presence of God. And so, I forgot my acolyte days. So, I went back and put my gloves on, came in, but you see my point. There's a level of where, yeah, we should have them on, and then at the same time we should not. So, you have to live in both camps when it comes to those things that are physically tied to where we say this is a place for the presence of God. In Stephen's day, it was primarily tied to one place. And Stephen's first argument is that he doesn't go, notice what he's doing. It's actually pretty, this is pretty genius act here. He moves not just back to the temple or to Solomon or even to Moses, but he starts with who? Abraham. And did Abraham have a physical place that was his? No, that's right. He didn't. He was he grew up first in Ur. Where's Ur? Iraq. And he leaves Iraq. So something had to generate leaving family, stability, things like that, and move all the way over to a place that he had no clue where he was going. He doesn't even get a map from God that says, yeah, leave Ur. You're going to settle in Canaan. He didn't even get that. He just says, go. And then eventually he sort of stays here for a while, and he moves up here for a little bit, goes down here for a little bit. But the whole time he has no geographical place that is his. And God still meets with him all the time. I mean, it's pretty smart by Stephen. I mean, you have to at least, whether or not you like Stephen or not in the Bible, I mean, the guy definitely could have been, he was a logic-based person. I mean, he'd been a great theological attorney. And because he's reminding them of this whole time in their own history where no one had a local geographical place that was set aside for the presence of God, and yet all along the way they are in the presence of God, which is pretty interesting. So what you'll see, at least in one of the major themes, is that the presence of God is not restricted to any one particular land or any one material building or place. And if that's the case, then the people of God should not be restricted on the same level. And, of course, he then also brings before them their refusal to accept and acknowledge that Jesus is the Messiah. And because of that, then, he's going to break with Moses to some degree, or at least it's going to sound like he's breaking with Moses, and he's going to break to some degree with the law over the idea of the sacrificial system. That if Jesus is the Lamb of God, if Jesus is the high priest, all those things that the book of Hebrews outlines, then Jesus usurps all of these now. Doesn't get rid of them, it's just he takes their place. So we no longer need those in the same level that we have them in Stephen's day. So those are the major tenets. We start this with the patriarchs, and he suggests that those. So what Stephen does in this first 8 verses is he suggests that those who are obedient to the heavenly vision will always live loosely to any particular earthly spot and go wherever God may guide them. Incidentally, do we do the same? You don't have to answer. I'm just asking myself that sometimes.
I know they got the people to lie about it,
Mm-hmm.
but everything you just said is directly attacking the whole Jewish system. I mean, you can be a Pharisee in the minds of the Sadducees.
Sure, yeah. I mean,
The Pharisee, he convicted himself pretty much by saying that.
right. And when we get to the end of the chapter, there are some that are like, we don't need any other people to testify. He's done it himself, and they take him out back and they execute him. So, I mean, but for him, he sees this as critiquing some of the mistakes that were and the conclusions that were drawn all throughout the history of the Old Testament. Right. No, so yeah, well, I mean, martyrs are loved in the history, but you know what makes a martyr a martyr? And often that pastors will call me and they'll ask, Shane, what would you do or whatever? And one of my first questions is this the thing you want to be martyred on? Now, for Stephen, it was. Because, again, for him, he is convinced that there is no one geographical place that can contain the presence of God. As wonderful as whatever those places are, God is larger than whatever box we try to put him in. And God has revealed himself chiefly in Jesus Christ now, and because of who Jesus is and what Jesus does, all these things that have sort of led to this now take a back seat. And so Stephen is gladly willing, and Stephen, he's gladly willing to put those in the back seat because of this, because he sees this as the revelation of the presence of God, now in a person and not in a place. Yeah, well, again, they, he doesn't make it after this. Okay, I mean, this is his last day. I mean, this is, you're getting the last. If anybody asks you what Stephen's last words are, there they are, right here. You got it. So I mean, these are the ones. But he is convinced of it. So much to the point that he will risk his life for this. It's an interesting. I mean, to look at Stephen and then to make, one of the things we want to do and not want to do, because I want to treat the text fairly. Whenever we read something in the Bible, a good kind of a test or rule of thumb would be is to put yourself compared against the person or the events or whatever they may be. And it's easy to say, oh yeah, you preach it, Stephen. Yes, we agree with this theologically. We see what you're doing. And then to say, oh wow, he went so far as to give his life for this. I'm not sure if I would be willing to do that, or I'd like to think that I would. I don't know. Just, don't walk away from the text feeling guilty. All right. I mean, that's not the purpose here. But you do see someone that is so committed that in the face of even the threat of his own life, he does not relinquish. He does not pull back. And, in the beginning, he's okay. But now when he gets down to this area, the language changes. I mean, it's almost like, he says, you stiff-necked people. I mean, there's just kind of, you really can't hide behind that translation. So I mean, he doesn't even try to paint it in a positive light. He just says, sorry guys, y'all missed it. But you do have, he goes back to the patriarchs. Abraham was not given any land at all, only a promise. But the promise was enough. And even when Abraham's faith was tested, that he would, he's told that his descendants would even have to leave the land that was his, which he had not received yet. And then there'll be a time where they will be oppressed for a while. Abraham still doesn't, he's still faithful to the point that he is willing to live with a sign, and the sign is of circumcision, which was not common back then. Now, circumcision was practiced by other religions. It just wasn't the type of circumcision. This is what most Old Testament scholars will say. The type of circumcision that Jews practiced was completely different than some of the other religions. And in a society that's not as clothed the way that we are, I mean, you can tell real quick who was circumcised fully and who was not. And so there's a level that to do this physically, I mean, you can't hide from that. And yet that's the way Abraham is. He is committed to the promise. Even when he faces opposition to the promise, he still is faithful. And Stephen starts here to help prove his point about what he now sees in Jesus Christ and what God is doing through the Spirit of God. All right, so a lot there to digest. Let's stop for a second, kind of regroup for a moment or two and make sure we see at least where we're at with Stephen. Pretty good? All good? All right, just still trying to wake up a little bit? All right, good deal. All right, so then if someone would read verses 9 through 19, that'll be our next segment. And so we're going to leave Abraham and Canaan, and now we're going to move into something, Exodus, that area of time. All right, thank you. Oh, that last part?
This king plotted against our people and forced parents to abandon their newborn babies so they would die.
All right. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So we have now where, again, instead of it being from Ur to Canaan, no physical place, now where have the people of God moved to? Egypt. That's right. And again, what did Stephen say? Because they're oh, shame. Where is it? Oh, because the people of because God is not restricted to any one land or one building, then the people of God should not be restricted to any one area, locality, or what have you. That to be obedient to the heavenly vision will always require God's people to live loosely to any particular earthly spot and go wherever God may guide them. And so Stephen, in his argument, has now left the patriarchs, and he's moved now into the children of Israel. Not give me those terms, and they're moved to Egypt at this time. And so here, the presence of God and the people of God are in all places are in Egypt. And so, I mean, Egypt hadn't always been seen as a place for the presence of God or the people of God. But you see what Stephen is doing in stacking his argument, that it's really not this. It's going to be this, the people of God that are tied to the Spirit of God, and that should direct what they do, how they live, what have you. God is continually guiding now these people of God, even in the opposition to God's calling. Jacob, his sons, they sell their brother Joseph into slavery at Egypt, but yet God is with that all along the way, and it'll eventually lead to some level of rise to power for Joseph and reconciliation with his brothers. And when this portion of Stephen's defense comes to an end, they're still in Egypt. I mean, he basically says, what was that last little bit? That verse 17, but as the time drew near for the fulfillment of the promise that God had made to Abraham, our people in Egypt increased and multiplied until another king who had not known Joseph ruled over Egypt. So you see that this is all part of God's plan, all part of the Spirit of God and the people of God, and yet it doesn't look anything like this, at least not yet. So let's stop here. So we went from patriarchs, no physical place, only a promise, but yet the people are faithful, to now here, still being obedient, even in the face of opposition. God still guiding, God still directing, and yet the promise of Abraham hasn't been fulfilled yet. I mean, he's got children, right? But the land is not his yet, right? That doesn't happen until after Exodus. All right, so any comments, questions about this second part of his defense?
In those first two, really the first three, there is no temple and is no law.
That's right, there's nothing. Yeah.
Present.
It's the presence of God and people being obedient to the presence of God. And it's not just a small group of folks. Now, one of the arguments could be, well, you really don't need some type of system set up for rules and regulations when it's just a small amount of folks. But there's a fair amount of folks here, and but there's not a law yet. There's not a temple. There's actually sin. There's a few times in Genesis that sin is introduced. All right, you've got it with Noah. You've got it, in through Cain and Abel, chapter 3. But the actual word for sin, or at least one of the words for sins in Old Testament, it's not many in Exodus. I mean, in Egypt, Genesis. Thank you. In Exodus, it's not introduced until about midway through the book. I mean, which is interesting. And now people live into the consequences, but you don't have. I mean, if you don't know what violations are, then you also, you don't need a remedy. Right? But once you know what violations are, then you need a means to which to be forgiven. Now, think back. Now, I see some puzzled looks. Think back to when did we do Exodus? Was that last year? A long time ago. Yeah. So they all run together. So think the Ten Commandments. Most time we see the Ten Commandments as something that, the thou shall nots. Right? I mean, it's like there's all the restrictions. You can't, stay away from this. Don't. Even like Genesis 3, Genesis 3. Don't eat of this one apple. But what we miss is the whole positive, all the things you can do. You can eat of every tree. Just safeguard this one. You can do a host of things. Just when it comes to God, be careful around these things. When it comes to living with people, do all kinds of things. Just be careful with these handful of things. And all the Ten Commandments were in Exodus were foul lines, because where were the children of Israel going? To Canaan. Yeah, they're going back to the promised land. Who lived in the promised land? People just like them? No. So they're going to Canaan. They're going to a totally different people, different religious structure, different way of life, different level of government. Everything is completely foreign. And so the Ten Commandments are those basic guidelines that keep their identity intact. Because before the Ten Commandments were given, there's this formal ceremony where God chooses them, they choose God. And that's Exodus chapter 19. Exodus 20 is when you get the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments are, well, look at it this way. If you're going to move to China, or your children were going to move to China, what would you give them? Or you give them a Bible. All right, why? All right, so hang on. Why would you give them a Bible? Yeah, so because there's something that you say the Bible can be helpful as part of who you are, your identity, because you might or might not find that there. Now, you might find it. I mean, there are tons of Christians. There are millions of Christians in China. But but you would want to make sure that if they weren't in that community, there would be something that could help them keep their identity. What else would you give them? A phone? Okay, yeah. For what reason? To keep in contact, because keep in contact with things like family, friends. Why? That's part of your identity. That's part of who you are. They help form who you are. We would do this naturally. I mean, maybe you'd give them a little American flag or something. I don't know. I mean, something. Give them some Georgia peaches or would you give them something that grits? That's what I would want is grits. All right. So, but you would want something that when you go into this place that is so completely unknown that you don't lose your way. So that's what the Ten Commandments are. It's not God pounding his fist down and saying, I'm going to zap you if you don't do these things. All they are just some manifestations of what they've already promised. They promised, said, we're going to be your people. Go home and read Exodus 19. There are different times that Moses goes up and down the mountain. On the fourth trip up is when he gets the Ten Commandments. The first three has to do with them claiming each other officially in a formal ceremony. And so then, okay, now that you've signed on the line, let me help you stay faithful to what you've pledged. Well, here they are. This can help you. And even though the Pharisees get a bad rap, all right? I mean, most of us, we read the New Testament, Pharisees. Well, the Pharisees realized that all throughout the history of the Old Testament, they've struggled with living into what they promise. So they had this bright idea, what they are like parents. I'm going to have to remember this. This is kind of coming out. I don't even have a pen, so John or Slade mark this in the video, right? So what do you do when you send your children out at various stages of their development? You don't want them to, you want them to remember who they are, things that you've tried to pour into them and instill into them. And the Pharisees looked back and said, we didn't do that as a people. So now that the parents become grandparents, they want to make sure that the grandchildren get it right. So they passed a bunch of laws on the Big Ten. So their intent is not to be controlling. Now, it might have morphed into that, but the intent is actually, I mean, we would do the same thing. If you look back on your history and you say, oh, I've made these mistakes, and so then when you get an opportunity you can't go back and redo them, but when you get an opportunity to make sure that those that you care for, maybe be in charge of, don't reinvent the same things you did, most of the time you're a little more in giving of rules and laws or whatever to try to safeguard them, not the other way. Well, it didn't work for me. Good luck, it might not work for you too. None of y'all do that. I mean, we just don't operate that way. If it's anything, I don't want to go and tell you my missteps, but I want to tip the scale so that you don't do them yourself. That's what the Pharisees were trying to accomplish. Now, over time, it evolved and evolved and evolved and evolved, and then you throw in some level of, when it comes to control and power and things like that, and you get a nice little, interesting cocktail that wasn't good, but you can get the idea of at least the intent of what they were trying to accomplish. It's not. I mean, it's the same as Exodus 20. You pledged to be with me, and I'm leading, I'm guiding, and so we haven't got to that yet. But all this is just the manifestation of what's already taken place, even if it's not written down on paper. You belong to me, I belong to you, so we're going to live distinctively. Circumcision is an example of that. Even in the face of oppositions between brothers, family dynamics, even when Abraham doesn't have a physical place, they're still following that vision, following that promise, because they've pledged themselves to each other. So I'm about to remember that. Parents and Pharisees. Somebody. This is kind of like you're watching me process out loud. Schedule parents and Pharisees today. All right. I won't forget it now. So I don't have a manuscript. I have a few. Yeah, exactly right. I have a few notes. So I don't have an actual manuscript. I probably need to do better with that. All right. So any questions about this? The patriarchs and then out into Egypt, because now we're going to begin to move out of Egypt and what we know with Moses. So that's let's start with verse 20 through 29. If someone would read that one for us. And then after this little discussion, we'll probably take a break. How about that?
At that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for in his father's house.
All right, I'm sorry, Beth. Let me stop for a second. This is something real distinctive about the text. Who has something in their Bible that says, I think, Beth, you said what, not an ordinary child? Who has something different? Yeah, anybody else have anything other than that? Yeah, all right, so what version of the Bible you have? Yeah, there you go. All right, nothing. I mean, they're all good, don't get me wrong. But more of a literal translation is that he was beautiful before God. And that's really about the only time that's used. It's a distinct phrase that's not used often. So anytime we find that in the Bible, obviously that brings a little bit of an asterisk, that phrase, beautiful before God. Anyway, that's one of my favorite phrases in the Bible, so you can just put a little asterisk that says, yeah, Shane highlighted it or whatever, that's fine. So, all right, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
For 3 months he was cared for in his father's house. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his fellow Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue him, but they did not. The next day Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, are you brothers? Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons.
All right, so we have this early days of Moses where he's not yet the leader of the children of Israel, but you see this level of cultivation, sort of the raw materials of what's there. He was hidden for a while, rescued by Egyptian princess, received the best education at that time. He's beautiful before God. And we also discover that if Pharaoh was the instrument to wean the children of Israel from Egypt, then Moses was the instrument to lead them out of Egypt. So again, this is all part of this no land that's theirs, presence of God leading the people. They're not tied to any geographical area. And if God is not tied to any geographical area, then the children of Israel or the people of God should not be tied to any geographical area. That they're operating on a promise. And they're being guided by God in however that promise plays itself out. Again, I want to say this. I want to go back and say this again. Stephen suggests that those who are obedient to God, to this heavenly vision, will always live loosely to any particular spot, earthly spot that is, and go wherever God may guide them. So I think part of what it means to be a Christian is none of this is all played out probably exactly how they liked it. I mean, put yourself in Abraham's shoes. It's just continually moving. And then, from the time he's given the promise of having a child until the time that Isaac is born, it's not like one page that we turn. It's years. There are 3 different times that Abraham says, "What about all this, God? Where's my descendants?" And one time actually the language is, pretty, where Abraham is sort of upset. And it's, my inheritance tied to this guy, Eleazar. Remember what you told me, God? When are you going to make good on this? So it's years in the making, and yet Moses is faithful. We turn the page from Genesis to Exodus, and we see, God blessed them under Joseph, and they eventually become these quasi-leaders, at least in a portion of Egypt. But it's hundreds of years before we meet Moses. And then we think, okay, Moses is up. He takes on the mantle, and then under God's help, performs all the signs. They walk out, and then like a couple of years later, they're in the Promised Land. No, it's hundreds of years. Now, it might be just a few before they start entering in, but until they sort of get established in Canaan, it's a while, multiple generations. And yet, what you find are these people who are still just little by little living loosely. And so, the idea that it's all going to be figured out, even with our faith, at some point we have to let that go. Now the big parts, they're clear. It's real clear every step of the way, the large parts. But down into how it plays out into every single aspect of life, that's the whole reason for the Holy Spirit. Which means at some point, you might not know which path to take, left or right. And I think sometimes God is like, either one is fine by me. As long as the big parts are taken care of, the small parts always work out. But it takes a people who are willing to just live loosely, however that plays out. Now, if you're like me and you like everything in a nice little container, this isn't always easy. I just want to pause for a minute and to see some of the bigger picture of that's not necessarily what Stephen is preaching about, but at least one of the things we can draw from our observations around the text is that I thought that another example, when you have a child and you go in, I don't know how y'all probably were better at it than Brooke and me. We had everything planned out for what was going to happen, how it was going to happen, and how we were going to respond to all that, and and what we were going to do at this age and that age. You just throw all that stuff out the water. I mean, just out the room. It just, well, that's kind of what it's like. I mean, just the big parts are taken care of, and then I think part of maturity is just really owning that not every little thing is as important as just those big things. And I think the older you get, the more you realize that, if they're healthy and they're happy and they're passionate about something, I'm all right with it. And I was having Connor was home for Thanksgiving, and we were talking about some things, whatever, and I said, well, are you still thinking about this for your profession? And he was like, well, truthfully, Dad, I really don't know. And I could see it was almost like, oh no, what's he going to, Dad's going to give me the speech, and I was like, yeah, don't worry about it, man. But now, a couple of years ago, I was like, no, you got to, this is what you got to do, and at some point, I mean, I still might circle back to that, but in a way that says, find something that that you're passionate about, and if, professionally, if it gives you energy and joy, and it can give you at least some level of living that you're trying to at least what you think is comfortable for you. Outside of that, I mean, help me, all right? So I'm a young parent, so what else do I need? I mean, what else should I try to instruct? And so there's a level of where, if we were to add that to a comparison of our faith, there's just a few things that are non-negotiable. Outside of that, I mean, it's to live loosely and realize that it's going to be okay. I mean, God has been faithful all along the way in all these steps. And they haven't even gotten here yet. And yet you still see that these people, if God is not tied to just a one single geographical area, then the people of God should not be. That what we've seen so far and what we will continue to see is that God's Spirit guides and directs. And I think what God desires is just people who will follow that, however that plays out. And it will look differently all throughout the church's history. It already looks different just in these little bits that we've looked at here. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like after, we get to here, you get to Stephen, you get to Acts, you leave Acts, you go through the New Testament, then you look at all the different church history and how that spread all throughout the world. What's consistent are those big things. But the way it plays out in every little place, sometimes they're miles apart. All right? So any comments, questions? I think it's time for a break here. That'll be a good one. So let's take about 10 minutes, and then we'll jump back into the second part of Moses in the wilderness and then in the temple. All right, so if you came in after our prayer, there should be one handout. and see if we can finish out the chapter. Maybe. Yeah, we need, I was going to say the first bell worked in the first time. The second bell, yeah, there we go. All right, perfect. All right, so we're in Acts still, 7, and we've looked at these first, remember, Stephen's defense is in 5 categories. We've looked at the first 3, at least before the break. We've been introduced to Moses, and we see some level of developments in him where he is going to be an instrument used by God, Pharaoh instrument to wean children of Israel from Egypt. Moses is the instrument to lead them out of Egypt. And so in this next portion, which is 30 through 43, we'll see Stephen's interpretation of that. So if someone would read for us this 4th section, which is chapter 7, verses 30 through 43. There are two gold stars remaining. The first one is 30 through 43. The second star will be 44 through 50. All righty?
After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to look more closely, he heard the Lord's voice. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals. The place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. Go to 39.
Go to 43.
Oh, okay. This is the same
Thanks.
Moses
That's right.
whom they had rejected with the words, who made you ruler and judge? He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and did wonders and miraculous signs in Egypt at the Red Sea and for 40 years in the desert. This is that Moses who told the Israelites, God will send you a prophet like me from your own people. He was in the assembly in the desert with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our fathers, and he received living words to pass on to us. But our fathers refused to obey him. Instead, they rejected him and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. They told Aaron, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. That was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it and held a celebration in honor of what their hands had made. But God turned away and gave them over to the worship of the heavenly bodies. This agrees with what is written in the book of the prophet. Okay. Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the desert, O house of Israel? Who have lifted up the shrine of Moloch and the star of your god, Rephan?
Mm-hmm.
The idols you made to worship. Therefore I will send you into exile beyond Babylon.
All right, so got a lot in this one here. So we've got Moses in the wilderness. He's leading the people out. And this the exile, this idea of Moses' exile is part of the divine plan. That the God who revealed himself to Abraham, to Joseph, is now speaking to Moses. And notice that the land that where the bush is what? Is what is it? Holy. And where is it? That's exactly Sinai. Where is it not? Yep, there we go. So we have another example of where we're still not at the temple yet. and wherever the presence of God is, leading his people. The message that Moses received is one of faithfulness to the promise already given. Right? That's part of the verses 30 through 34. That this whole idea that started back with the patriarchs made its way to Egypt, and now in the person Moses, and even in this wilderness coming out of Egypt, is all a level of fulfillment to the promise that was given back with Abraham. We also see in verses 35 through 43, you can make some parallels between Moseph, that's a mixture between Moses and Joseph. So if you were to compare them, you would get Moseph, and you can see that both Moses and Joseph, their first time with the people, they're rejected. Second time with the people, they are accepted. You see that with Moses. First time he goes down, they reject him. Second time, they follow to some degree. You see the same thing with Joseph. He is with his brothers. He is sold into slavery, into prison. Second time they come in, it's completely different. So for Stephen, Moses is a forerunner to Jesus. See, there's one of the connections for Stephen in his defense. And in the wilderness, the children of Israel had everything that they needed, which was the presence of God. All right, remember back to, when we first started this whole defense, was that the presence of God is not tied to any particular land or particular place. Therefore, the people of God should not be restricted in those same to any particular place, locality, geographical area, what have you. That they are to follow the presence of God, living loosely. And this is another example that under Moses in the wilderness, the people had everything that they needed, which was the presence of God. Yet, was that enough? No. Because in verses 39 through 41, we find that the children of Israel were not content, which then led to disobedience. And for Stephen, who was charged with blasphemy against Moses and the doctrines that come after Moses, he considers the charges where he's not the one that is guilty of blasphemy, but actually the charges stem from the descendants of the people who refused Moses' authority in the wilderness. Okay, so let me say it better this way. The descendants of the children of Israel, of the people in the wilderness, are the ones who charged Stephen with blasphemy. Right? For Stephen, he says, I'm not the one who is guilty of this. You are, because your descendants are the ones that weren't faithful in the wilderness. See if that might be an easier way of saying it. He considered the charges from the descendants as something where they refused Moses' authority in the wilderness because they had everything that they needed, the presence of God, and yet that was not enough. Are you with me? Maybe? I'm still processing out loud. In my notes, it just says the children of Israel, it wasn't enough for them in the wilderness. They had it all, the presence of God, yet it wasn't enough. The presence of the invisible God was not enough for them, and for Stephen, this is the beginning of idolatry, which eventually led them into exile with the Assyrians and ultimately with the Babylonians. Right?
It's the same sin over and over.
That's right. Yeah, they absolutely. God is not tied to a place. God reveals himself. People respond loosely to what they've received and walk in that direction. And here you have the children of Israel who have received now the same things as the patriarchs, the same things as the people in Egypt, same things as people as Moses, and now in the wilderness, that is not enough for them. And in return, they commit idolatry by creating these idols, and Stephen is considered to be blasphemous because he is not agreeing with what Stephen would call the descendants of the people in the wilderness. Are you with me? Hopefully. That didn't come out right, so I just want to make sure we're on the same page. So just process it for about a second or two, and then I'm going to open it up. We have plenty of time. Any questions? 39 through 43 is pretty important in Stephen's argument, because this is the beginning of where it really goes downhill for Stephen. See, up until then, he's just been setting an argument where he hasn't really charged them. He hasn't pushed back and said, y'all are the guilty ones. Here, he is starting to say, you are the guilty ones. I've just proven 3 different ways that all that is needed is the presence of God. And you've seen this with the patriarch, you see it in Egypt, you see it with Moses. The children of Israel, and now you're the descendants of them, they are the ones that committed blasphemy and idolatry, because what they were given by God, they perceived that to be not enough. And so he's going to actually say your descendants were guilty of that, and now you're guilty of that, because ultimately what you've received, and you've said that's not enough. He hadn't gotten there yet, that's coming. But he's starting, so he's beginning to pound the podium a little bit.
I think that you've made this point before, maybe in things that Paul and sermons that he's preached, is that he goes back to the beginning where they all agree.
Right, that's right.
If they agree with the patriarchs, and if they agree with Egypt, and if they agree with Moses,
Then they should have the same conclusion. That's right. Yeah, so the statement is, if you're online with us, or if you didn't hear what Becky was saying, was that Paul and some other people in the New Testament, they have the same methodology as Stephen. They actually go back to where at least both parties would agree, patriarchs, Egypt, Moses. So for Stephen, if 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, then they should all be at 3. But what Stephen is going to say is that we're not. I'm at 3, and you're at something else. And because you're at something else, then you're just as guilty of those who were at something else back in the wilderness. Because they then made idols, verses 42 and 43. They worshipped, I think, I think this says like heaven, host of heaven. Somebody have that? This is verse 42. Host of heaven. Does anybody have like planetary powers or something like that? Heavenly bodies, yeah. So this is a little bit of you need to know a little bit of the context here. The quote from the prophet is from the book of Amos. Right? So Amos was a prophet to the northern kingdom, 10 tribes in the north, and it's just before, he's one of the last prophets before the Assyrians come in. So we're at 7-something BC, 721 BC. And so Amos is the last prophet to the northern kingdom, and one of the struggles for the northern kingdom, you really see this from the break after Solomon. So when Solomon dies, the kingdom divides into 2 parts again. You got Rehoboam, who is Solomon's son, who is going to be the king of the southern part, and you got Jeroboam. Some of you that were in Egypt, remember when it rained and we walked through all that water, and it was, can't remember what trip that was. I think that was the one that St. Paul, Israel, what did I say? Egypt, sorry. We didn't go to Egypt, Israel. Yeah, exactly right. Thank you. It's been a long morning already. And it was the day that was all that water, and we walked all over everywhere to find this one thing. But we eventually ended to where we had the remnants of one of the sacred areas that Jeroboam built to help solidify the revolt from the southern kingdom. Remember, he built 2 worship centers. One was in the far north, which was in the area of Dan. That's the one we visited. The other one was just above the line, the border that divided the north and the south. And the idea was that if Jeroboam was going to divide the house, and the worship center was the temple was in Jerusalem in the south, he wanted to create separate worship centers for people in the north, so they would not have to go to the south. If they go down to the south, then maybe they want to stay like they are under one king. And so part of what Jeroboam did was a political, sort of this religious political act to create worship centers in the north. One is just above the line, but the other one is in the far Dan area north. We saw that Dan area, all right? So it divides the house into two empires. You got in the north, it's always called Israel. So when you read in your Chronicles and your Kings and your Samuels and all that, where it says the kingdom of Israel or O Israel, is talking about the north. The south is always referred to as Judah. So Isaiah 43, hear, O Israel, hear, O Judah. He's talking to the whole group here. But just kind of FYI, when you hear Israel after the division, it's the north. Judah is in the south. So they're like that for about 100 and something years. The kingdom divides around 921, around maybe roughly close to 200 years. That's when the Assyrians are getting ready. They're the big people on the block. They're going to come down from over where Syria is now and Lebanon from the north, and they're going to take over the 10 tribes. Amos is one of the last prophets to the northern kingdom, warning them about what's going on or what's going to happen when it comes to the Assyrian Empire. The problem that was going on theologically or religiously in that day is what we call syncretism. They still had their worship areas that was somewhat tied to Yahweh or Jehovah, but right next to that they would have Moloch and Rephaim and all these other gods from the surrounding areas. And so you could what they created was a one-stop shop. This is where, all right, so Walmart, religiously, not good. All right? One-stop shop in the Old Testament is not a good place to be. And so Amos is, the quote here from Amos is, you will go and sacrifice to some degree at, those areas that have always been assigned to Yahweh back here. But then you turn around on your next step and you go and sacrifice to Moloch and you sacrifice to this goddess and that god, whatever, as if to cover all your bases. And Amos is saying that's a big no-no. And Stephen is faulting the children of Israel for this. Because if the presence of God is enough, then you don't need all these other little worship centers to cover your bets. That's syncretism. And so you have this idea about, during Amos' time, people they were constantly worshiping there, and they would make sacrifices at all areas. And so Stephen reinterprets Amos, his reference to sacrifice to something that the children of Israel were doing at that time, as not in line, eventually that will lead to this. So it's a forerunner of where he's really going to lower the boom in verses 44 through 50, where then he just sort of kind of says, I'm not the one who is guilty of blasphemy, you are. So let's move into 44 through 50, if somebody would read that and be our last Gold Star winner. What verse is that? Go to, yes, stop there. All right, perfect. Thank you. Part of the reason why I ask you to read is so I can revisit whatever notes I've had to make sure we're on point. Because if I was reading them, then I'd have to look down at my notes. We'd have a long silence, hang on, let me gather all this in, So, again, see what Stephen is doing. He has talked about all this, about the presence of God, not tied to a local area. He even here, when he's moving in on the temple, goes back and says, for the longest time, God lived in a tent, movable. And then it was David that wanted to had an idea for a fixed place. Solomon, the one that actually constructed it. And then you've got this phrase, however, the Most High does not. And then he fills in, does not do all these things. Again, he is still staying on this idea that the people of God, because the presence of God is not fixed, as in tied to a geographical area, the people of God should not be. And so here, this is where Stephen disagreed with the idea, not so much that there was a temple as being a physical place, because you had places that were set aside to some degree, but the state of mind associated with the fixed spot. Are you with me? It's kind of like if we can only worship God in our sanctuary here at St. Paul, which we think is a good place, right? You can get to a state of mind with that where we really just need to get rid of the chapel and the CWC. Right? You're not in agreement? Why not? I mean, so y'all must agree with Stephen, all right? But that's where we're at. So it's not just that Stephen is not saying, even though he's been talking about moving, presence of God, not tied to a place, but everywhere along the way, he visited Abraham and he names the place. They were in Egypt. That's a geographical area. There's a burning bush. That's a physical area. There's a tent that they set up and took down. He understands that there will be places that are physical, geographical, material that are tied to the presence of God. His critique is that you can go so far with this that then encases the presence of God and limits not just God, but the people, and that is his critique here. The temple itself is not bad, even in Stephen's eyes. It's the fact that it then becomes the exclusive place for God's presence, and that God can't act outside of the temple, because this is all now encases who God is and what God does. Same argument Paul will make with once someone believes, the Spirit of God lives in them, and then they become what of God? The temple of God, right? It's because here we have Jesus who's outside of the temple, and yet Stephen will say therein lies the revelation of the presence of God in human form. So you with me? You see his argument? Stephen has basically outlined what would become the doctrine of the church universal. So when you quote the Apostles' Creed, we believe in what? The holy. That's not Catholicism, right? I mean, the word back then, there wasn't Catholicism didn't exist when the Apostles' Creed was written. It was just one church under God. Christian would probably be, and so the word Catholic actually means universal. Just the etymology over time, the word has changed. You don't get Catholicism until you get the Reformation, 1500s. But Stephen, people who, whenever you read books on the church universal or the church that exists under Jesus Christ, and they have to go back and quote, a lot of times they'll highlight some of Acts for sure.
Maybe one Sunday you can mention that sometime, because I didn't know that.
Well, it's a coming. A sermon series on the Apostles' Creed. Yeah.
I know, I was like, I thought they were front back then. Why would
It's yeah. So we have some sermon series. Sure. Yeah, some bulletins, and we probably should. It's an easy fix. You just put a little asterisk down it. You just say Catholic means universal. I mean, yes, ma'am. Some denominations and churches have actually went ahead and replaced the word. I mean, we don't use the creeds in their entirety because part of the Apostles' Creed says that Jesus did before he ascended. He descended into hell. Well, think back to Reformation. So the whole idea of purgatory is developed around the 4th century. And from there, it sort of just evolves into a number of different things. Part of the Reformation in the protest, where we get Protestants from, the protest against the practices of that day, one of the major tenets of protest was this whole idea of purgatory. So anything that has to do with descending for a period of time and then ascending, Protestants said, absolutely not. For instance, the indulgence, another one. Yeah, absolutely. And even the community of the saints. So all saints for Protestants is a modern, it's sort of a reclaiming of something that's been around for a long time ago. Think back to when you were little girls. I probably did not celebrate All Saints Day. It was like a no-no, right? It's kind of like wearing orange and blue when you go to a Georgia game, right? Or wearing red and black when you go to an Auburn game or what have you. It's just, I've got a friend of mine, he's a diehard Tech fan, and I made the mistake one day of buying him a red shirt. It doesn't mean anything to me, So I was like, well, it's happy birthday. He's like, I don't wear red. And I was like, what do you mean? And then I was like, oh my God, yeah, okay. And he goes, I don't have a single red thing in my wardrobe. And I was like, that's a bit much, isn't it? But same thing. And I just lost my place. So anyway, it's getting close to a time to stop. But you see, this is the beginning of the doctrine of the universal church. And the idea is that the presence of God, the movement of the Spirit is outside, it transcends any one particular area. So here, he's talking about it with space. Also in Acts, what's going to be described with Philip is people. Oh, I didn't realize that until I just said it. I have to make me another note. Because when we get to Acts chapter 8, Philip is evangelizing in Samaria. Again, a no place. So you have in 7 geographical space in the presence of God. In 8, you have people. I need to write myself a little commentary on this because this is not in anything I've read. So anyway, we're going to hold off on his death until next week. I did give you a little quote because one of the phrases that often we ask about whenever we look at the passage in verse 56 is when Stephen is when he's being executed, he looks up and he sees the heaven, and so a lot of people want some description around that. What I gave you around N.T. Wright to me is the best maybe paragraph on that without going into all types of detail. All right, which is now it's time to eat and take a nap to do this whole chapter in an hour. I'm proud of myself because there was a lot of there's a number of rabbit holes. What's that? I did. Well, I'll tell you what. The good news is that we have a John Few who will put this on our website in about maybe even today or maybe by tomorrow, and you can get it all again. So, all right, go in peace. May the Lord be with you.